conclusion is far from settled, unfortunately. We have an extra 20 years of research, 20 years of data, and there are different economists that have different views on the long-run prospects for these economies. The fundamental concern all along has been the long-term economic development of mineral extracting countries. The measurement of short-term growth was simply an indicator of whether there was some structural problem in these economies. We have to ask, why is there short-term slower growth? Is there some structural problem with these economies that's going to persist in the long run? And in fact, what we've discovered is that there's nothing that we can see that predicts that this short-run growth will persist in the long run, or that it will result in negative outcomes in the long run. The long-term impact, certainly, as far as we can tell, is going to be positive. When we measure the long-term growth of these countries to date, not only the short run, but the long run growth, starting from 1700, 1750, 1800, when we measure that period through some very sophisticated techniques, we actually see that they've grown more rapidly as a result of their mineral endowment. And there's no reason to think that that rapid growth over the long run will slow down. The resource curse theory takes a short-run phenomenon and projects it to a long-run outcome. And the short run, by the way, is 20 years is the measurement period. When we extend that to 30 or 40, it actually disappears. And when we start again from 1700 or 1800 or measure forward, it also disappears. So it seems to be a statistical artifact, just a curiosity or a outcome of the measurement period that was selected. There is evidence that there's cyclicality that may be slowing growth, but it's not enough of a break to stop the long-run progress. The difference between a resource curse and the resource drag is our understanding of what's going on in the economy. Resource curse implies that slow growth is a result of some structural problems in the economy that are going to persist in the long run. Resource drag attributes the slow growth in the economy to a sluggish resource sector. Most resource prices have been declining over our period of measurement, 1970 to 2010. When resource prices decline, so does resource output and so does economic growth. The main difference, therefore, is the implication for the long run. The resource drag is associated with short-run declining prices. The resource curse is associated with structural problems that will persist in the long run. The evidence is mixed. The early evidence did indeed indicate that extractive industries caused weakened institutions. But the more recent testing, we now have more data and we now have more sophisticated techniques. We've learned over time how to test these things. And the more recent data actually shows that there's no impact of minerals on institutions. Certainly, we've known forever that bad institutions are not good for economic development. And certainly there are some countries with bad institutions and oil. We don't tend to blame the oil, we don't tend to blame the minerals, we tend to blame the bad institutions for the bad outcomes. There does again appear to be a statistical link between resource extraction and increased corruption within an economy. That negative outcome, however, does not seem to overwhelm the positive benefits from having resources. And I want to keep emphasizing that because there are positive effects and negative effects going on at the same time. And sometimes we parse these out and measure them separately, but in my view, what we want is the overall impact, and currently we view that as being positive. Developing economies on the brink of emergence into developed economies do become more unequal. Perhaps the way to view that is, did minerals make them more unequal? They certainly are unequal societies. We know that because developing economies on the brink of emergence into developed economies do become more unequal. Minerals do tend to worsen that inequality initially, and the hope, of course, is that governments will rectify that. We've looked at that as well as economists, and the evidence seems to be that resource extraction eliminates or reduces poverty. Certainly we cannot say that in every instance resource extraction has been good for an economy, but the trend seems to be that poverty reduces when income extraction increases. Whenever we talk about outcomes, we talk about trends. Yes, trends are averages. Outcomes are hugely varied. We can't say much about an individual country because that's a data point of one. What we tend to do is take collective experience and talk about trends or averages over the collection of countries. I think resource policy is very mixed. There's been a general fear in mineral-based economies about the resource curse, and there certainly has been efforts to diversify away from minerals. Those diversification efforts have not typically been successful. But there are other economies that have been very good with their resource policy, and those economies have greatly benefited from their resources. They have stayed the course with the resources and in fact tried to enhance their resource concentration and exporting. The recent research showing that the resource curse may not in fact hold is so recent that I don't think it's had a chance yet to filter into policy. Certainly, though, some economies have grasped resources as a benefit ever since the start of their extraction. Countries may want to foster their resource sector rather than diversify away from their resource sector. Incentivizing oil, incentivizing mining, keeping these sectors going. In my view, those economies that have stopped or diminished their extractive activity have done so because of policy. The resources weren't exhausted. It was simply incentives that were diminished. I think countries with newly discovered resources like Mongolia, like Afghanistan, like Greenland, they should look to the successes. They should look to those countries that have managed their resources well. And they should also look to failures. They should look to those countries that have not managed their resources well. They are not the front runners. They can look at history and they can learn from history.
Welcome to the new debate.